Who were the Goths?
The Goths were a group of Germanic tribes who originated in what is now Scandinavia. As early as the 3rd century AD, the Goths invaded the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. During the following century, they divided into two groups, a western group known as the Visigoths, who predominated north of the lower Danube River, in Central Europe, and an eastern group known as the Ostrogoths, who were situated north of the Black Sea, between Europe and Asia. Along with other tribal Germanic peoples, the Goths brought the downfall of the Roman Empire.
What is the Treaty of Paris?
There has been more than one Treaty of Paris. The following international agreements were signed in the French capital. In 1763, representatives of Great Britain, France, and Spain signed a treaty, which, along with the Treaty of Hubertusburg, February 15, 1763, ended the 7 Years' War, 1756–63. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris, which had been under negotiation since 1782, was signed by the British and the Americans, represented by statesman Benjamin Franklin. 1706–1790, John Adams, 1735–1826, and John Jay, 1745–1829. The agreement officially ended the American Revolution, 1775–83, establishing the United States as an independent country and drawing the boundaries of the new nation, which extended west to the Mississippi River, north to Canada, east to the Atlantic Ocean, and south as far as Florida, which was given to Spain. In 1814 and 1815 treaties were signed ending the Napoleonic Wars, which the French ruler Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, had begun shortly after taking power in 1799. In 1856, European nations signed a treaty in Paris ending the Crimean War, 1853–56, and outlawing the wartime practice of privateering. The Treaty of Paris that was signed December 10, 1898, settled the conflict that had resulted in the Spanish-American War, 1898. This treaty provided for Cuba's full independence from Spain. It also granted control of Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. The pact further stipulated that the United States would pay Spain $20 million for the Philippine Islands. In 1951, in the wake of World War II, 1939–45, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany signed the Treaty of Paris, which established the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC. The desire was to bring about economic and political unity among the democratic nations of Europe. This agreement paved the way for the European Union effected by the Maastricht Treaty, an economic agreement signed by representatives of 12 European countries in the Netherlands in 1992.
Why is Spain's Alhambra historically important?
The elaborate palace, built east of the city of Granada, in southern Spain, was built by Moors, Muslim North Africans who occupied the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal, for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. The fortified structure, built between 1238 and 1354, is a monument of Islamic architecture in the Western world. Its name is derived from an Arabic word meaning red, the highly ornamental palace. With its decorative columns, walls, and ceilings, was constructed of red brick. Perched on a hilltop, the Alhambra was the last stronghold of the Moors in Spain. In 1492 the palace was captured by forces of Spain's King Ferdinand. 1452-1516, and Queen Isabella, 1451-1504.
What was the Norman conquest?
The Norman conquest is the brief but critical period in British history that began when the French Duke William of Normandy, c. 1028-1087, sailed across the English Channel in 1066 and invaded England. This was upon the death of what would turn out to be England's last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, c. 1003-1066, while William became known as William the Conqueror. And he did conduct a brutal conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, he might have had reason to believe. He could claim the English throne upon King Edward's death, the named successor, Harold, c. 1022-1066, of the powerful Wessex family, had 2 years earlier become shipwrecked off the coast of France, where he reportedly took an oath that he would, upon King Edward's death, support William of Normandy, who was King Edward's distant cousin, as heir. Hearing of Edward's death, William and his army set sail for England, where Harold had already assumed the throne as King Harold II. But Harold had previously quarrelled with his brother Tostig, and the noble Wessex family was divided and engaged in a power struggle. Tostig was joined in his fight by the Norwegians who, at the same time that William was landing on England's southern coast, invaded from the north. Thus, William and his troops entered England without opposition. Since Harold was focusing his efforts elsewhere. Though the king defeated the Norwegians and Tostig, who was slain in battle, he would not emerge the victor in his subsequent battle with William. On October 14 the two met in battle at Hastings, near the entrance to the Strait of Dover. Though he fought valiantly, Harold was killed. William was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. Within a few years, by 1070, he had killed many Anglo-Saxon nobles and the rest he deprived of their land. In the 21 years of his reign, William imposed Norman aristocracy on England. required that French be spoken at court, and drew England closer to Europe. He ruled until his death in 1087. After which the Norman nobility mixed with what was left of the Anglo-Saxons. It is this intermingling that produced the English language from the German tongue of the Anglo-Saxons combined with the Norman French. William's descendants, albeit distantly so, have ruled England ever since his takeover in 1066.
When were antiseptics introduced to surgery?
Antiseptics, which prevent infections, were introduced in the middle of the 19th century. And by the end of the century were in widespread use. The introduction in 1846 of anesthetics such as ether and chloroform handled the problem of pain during surgery. But even after successful operations, patients were dying or becoming permanently disabled from infections contracted while in the hospital. These infections, which often became epidemic inside the medical facilities, included tetanus, gangrene, and septicemia. In 1846 Hungarian obstetrician Ignaz Philip Semmelweis, 1818–1865, who was practicing at a Vienna hospital, concluded that infection, in this case puerperal, or childbirth fever, was coming from inside the hospital ward. His analysis was met with strong rebuttal. While he began practicing antisepsis, cleanliness to reduce infection, and his statistics showed a decrease in mortality rates, the methods did not gain acceptance in the medical community. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1864, English surgeon Joseph L. Lister, 1827–1912, became interested in French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur's 1822–1895 work with bacteria. While practicing surgery in Glasgow, Lister replicated Pasteur's experiments and concluded that the germ theory applied to hospital diseases. In order to stave off inflammation and infections in his patients, Lister began working with solutions containing carbolic acid, which kills germs, observing favorable results. Lister reported his findings in 1867 in the British Journal of Medicine Lancet. Many physicians still rejected Lister's claims that antisepsis could reduce the danger of infection. Nevertheless, the medical community began adopting these methods. By the turn of the century, not only had these principles saved lives, they had transformed the way doctors practice medicine. Since doctors could not ensure necessary cleanliness in their patients' homes, hospitals became the preferred place to treat all patients, not just the poor or the very sick.
Is bluegrass music a distinctly American genre?
Yes, the style of music developed out of country music during the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s. Bill Monroe, 1911–1996, a country and bluegrass singer-songwriter, altered the tempo, key, pitch, and instrumentation of traditional country music to create a new style named for the band that originated it. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe's home state was Kentucky. Bluegrass was first heard by a wide audience when in October 1939. Monroe and his band appeared on the popular country music radio program The Grand Ole Opry. Although bluegrass evolved through several stages and involved a host of contributors, through it all Bill Monroe remained the guiding and inspirational force, and therefore merits the distinction of being the father of bluegrass.
What was the trial of the 20th century?
As the century drew to a close, American historians, legal experts, and the public considered which of the many trials hailed as the trial of the 20th century actually was. But the criteria used by each person varied. Some believed the most important trial was the most highly publicized. Others believed it was a trial in which the verdict affected everyone. Some thought it was a trial that most epitomized an era. And some believed the most important trial was the one that inspired the most public debate. Still others looked for a single trial that seemed to have it all: notoriety, impact, reflections of society at large, and a controversial outcome. Among the courtroom dramas that were mentioned were, the 1907 to 1908 trial of Harry Thaw, 1871 to 1947, whose lawyers went through two trials. The first ended in a deadlocked jury, to convince jurors that Mr. Thaw suffered from dementia Americans, a condition supposedly unique to American men, that had caused Thaw to experience an uncontrollable desire to kill a man who had had an affair with his wife. The case took innocent by reason of insanity to new heights. The well-to-do, Harvard-educated Thaw was declared not guilty. The 1921 case of Nicola Sacco, 1891 to 1927, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 1888-1927. Italian-born anarchists charged with and, amidst international uproar, found guilty of murder and robbery. So many people were convinced of the pair's innocence that demonstrations were mounted in cities around the world. They were executed in August 1927, but 50 years later Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts signed a special proclamation clearing their names. The Bruno Richard Hauptmann, 1899 to 1936, trial of 1935. The German-born defendant was convicted of murdering the 20-month-old son of celebrated aviator Charles A. Lindbergh, 1902 to 1974, and his noted wife Anne Morrow Lindbergh, 1906 to 2001. After the child was kidnapped from the family's Hopewell, New Jersey home on March 1, 1932. For 2.5 months, the world had prayed for the safe return of Charles Jr. But the toddler's body was found on May 12, 2 miles from the Lindbergh home. Public outrage demanded justice. Evidence surfaced that implicated Hauptmann. who was tried January 2 to February 13, 1935. Found guilty, he died by electrocution. Influential journalist H. L. Mencken noted that the trial, in which the conviction seemed to hinge on circumstantial evidence and which was attended by a circus-like atmosphere, was the biggest story since the resurrection. Though many remained convinced that officials had acted hastily to bring a case against Hauptmann, and maintained that he'd been framed, efforts to clear his name continued to be denied into the 1990s. The 1931 to 1937 trials of the so-called Scottsboro Boys, 9 men, ranging in age from 12 to 20, who had been seized from several points along a 42-car train in northeastern Alabama and were promptly charged with raping 2 white women. Upon medical examination, the women showed no signs of having been raped or even of having had intercourse in the time frame in question. Nevertheless, the court of public opinion in the segregated South saw to it that 8 of the 9 were convicted of the crime. In spite of overwhelming evidence and testimony supporting their innocence. The 1995 case of former football player O.J. Simpson, 1947, who was tried and acquitted in the murders of his former wife, Nicole, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. One observer said this trial had it all: women, minorities, public interest, domestic violence. Fallen hero, and through its live media coverage had exposed the legal system to the public. Other trials routinely mentioned in considering the question included the cases of convicted murderers Leopold and Loeb, the infamous Scopes monkey trial, which pitted faith against reason, religion against science, and tradition against modernity, the Nuremberg trials, which established a process that brought war criminals to justice, the case of Alger Hiss, who was either a traitor or the victim of a framing for political advantages at the highest levels, and the Rosenberg espionage case. Undoubtedly there are trials missing from even this long list. There can be no definitive answer to the question.
What was the germ theory?
The germ theory, established in the mid-1800s, posited that certain germs cause diseases, refuting the ages-old notion of spontaneous generation. The idea was first put forth by French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, 1822 to 1895, in a paper he published in 1861. His research, and that of German physician Robert Koch, 1843 to 1910, eventually substantiated the germ theory as fact. They proved that the microbe, or germ, is a living organism that can cause disease. Koch was even able to isolate certain bacteria as the causes of particular diseases, including anthrax, for which he published a method of preventive inoculation, tuberculosis, cholera, and rinderpest, a cattle disease. The anthrax germ was the first germ linked to a particular disease by Koch in 1876. By the end of the 1800s, researchers had discovered the kinds of bacteria and other microbes responsible for the plague. diphtheria, dysentery, gonorrhea, leprosy, malaria, pneumonia, tetanus, and other infectious diseases.
What does Epicurean mean?
While Epicurean has come to refer to anything relating to the pleasure of eating and drinking, it is an oversimplification of the beliefs of the Greek philosopher Epicurus, 341 to 270 b.C., from whose name the word was derived. While Epicurus did believe that pleasure is the only good, and that it alone should be humankind's pursuit, later scholars misinterpreted the philosophy as a license for sensory excess. In actuality, Epicurus defined pleasure not as unbridled sensuality but as freedom from pain and as peace of mind, which can only be obtained through simple living. In about 306 BC, Epicurus established a school in Athens, which came to be known as the Garden School because residents provided for their own food by gardening. There he and his students strived to lead lives of simplicity, prudence, justice, and honor. In this way, they achieved tranquility, the ultimate goal in life. According to the philosophy of Epicureanism, he further believed that intellectual pleasures are superior to sensual pleasures, which are fleeting. In fact, he held that one of the greatest and most enduring pleasures is friendship. These ideas were put forth by the Greek philosopher and writer Lucretius, c. 99 c. 55 BC, in his poem On the Nature of Things. While the Epicurean school endured for several centuries, ultimately Christian leaders deemed the philosophy a pagan creed. However, some critics have posited that the writer of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament of the Bible was likely a member of the Garden School and that the epistles of St. Paul in the New Testament were strongly influenced by Epicurean thought. In more recent times, Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, author and signatory of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States, was a self-proclaimed Epicurean.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase according to Hoyle.
What were Voltaire's beliefs?
The prolific French writer's corpus of 52 works were produced as part of his lifelong effort to expose injustices. Voltaire's famous words, "Écrasez l'infâme," squash that which is evil, encapsulate his tenets. He believed in God, but abhorred priestly, high church, traditions. He spread the doctrines of rational skepticism to the world. He strongly advocated religious and political tolerance. And he held great faith in humankind's ability to strive for perfection. To the European literary world, he embodied the highest ideal of the Age of Reason, also called the Enlightenment. But victims of his wit feared and denigrated him. Celebrated by some during his lifetime, he has certainly been celebrated since. His masterpiece, Candide, 1759, a satirical tale exploring the nature of good and evil, has been translated into more than 100 languages.
What is the era?
The era stands for the Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment proposed by Congress in 1972. It stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. In proposing the amendment, Congress gave the states 10 years in which to ratify it. But in 1982 only 35 of the necessary 38 states had approved the amendment, which then died. The failure to ratify the era was the result of disagreement over how the language would be interpreted. Supporters believed the amendment would guarantee women equal treatment under the law. Opponents feared the amendment might require women to forfeit the financial support of their husbands and require them to serve in the military.
What were Sir Francis Bacon's beliefs?
The English philosopher, author, and statesman was one of the great minds of the scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s, during which the way that Europeans viewed themselves and the universe underwent a dramatic change. Bacon, 1561 to 1626, believed that humankind's accepted notions about nature should be aggressively challenged. As a young man studying at Trinity College, he concluded that the Aristotelian system, or deductive logic, was without merit. Bacon favored observation, or inductive logic, as a system for interpreting and understanding nature. He argued that the understanding of nature was being held back by the blind acceptance of the beliefs of ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and Plato, c. 428 to 347 BC. A religious person, Bacon maintained that theology should not be questioned. He believed that rational inquiry can unlock the secrets of nature but not of the human soul. Bacon therefore insisted on the separation of philosophy and theology, an idea that ran counter to the academic traditions of the time. Consequently, he was a staunch proponent of educational and scientific reform. Trained in law, Bacon served as a royal diplomat in France, was admitted to the bar, elected to Parliament. and served in public office, including the jobs of Solicitor General and Attorney General. He penned several seminal works, including essays, 1597, which consists of practical wisdom and observations. Advancement of Learning, 1605, a survey of the state of knowledge. Bacon was attempting to enlist the support of the king in the total reform of education and science in England, and Novum Organum, 1620. In which he put forth his method for understanding nature by an inductive system, based on direct observation. Versus Aristotle's deductive method, which was based on circumstantial evidence and prior conclusions.
Where did Christopher Columbus first land in the New World?
Columbus, 1451–1506, set sail from Palos, in southwest Spain. On August 3, 1492, and he sighted land on October 12 that year. Going ashore, he named it San Salvador. Alternately called Wuddlings Island, today it is one of the Bahamas. With his fleet of 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, Columbus then continued west and south, sailing along the north coast of Cuba and Haiti, which he named Hispaniola. When the Santa Maria ran aground, Columbus left a colony of about 40 men on the Haitian coast where they built a fort, which, being Christmas time, they named La Navidad. Navidad means Christmas in Spanish. In January 1493 he set sail for home, arriving back in Palos on March 15 with a few Indians, Native Americans, as well as some belts, aprons, bracelets, and gold on board. News of his successful voyage spread rapidly, and Columbus journeyed to Barcelona, Spain, where he was triumphantly received by Ferdinand and Isabella. On his second voyage, which he undertook on September 25, 1493, he sailed with a fleet of 17 ships and some 1,500 men. In November he reached Dominica, Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Upon returning to Haiti, Hispaniola, Columbus found the colony at La Navidad had been destroyed by natives. In December 1493 he made a new settlement at Isabella, present-day Dominican Republic. The eastern end of Hispaniola, which became the first European town in the New World. Before returning to Spain in 1496, Columbus also landed at Jamaica. On his third voyage, which he began in May 1498, Columbus reached Trinidad, just off the coast of South America. On his fourth and last trip he found the island of Martinique before arriving on the North American mainland at Honduras, in Central America. It was also on this voyage, in May 1502, that he sailed down to the Isthmus of Panama, finally believing himself to be near China. But Columbus suffered many difficulties, and in November 1504 he returned to Spain for good. He died 2 years later in poverty and neglect. He had, of course, never found the westward sea passage to the Indies in the Far East. Nevertheless, the Caribbean islands he discovered came to be known collectively as the West Indies, and the native peoples of North and South America came to be known collectively as Indians.
What was the Ptolemaic system?
It was a scheme devised by the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy, c. 170 c. 100 BC. He proposed a system that placed Earth directly at the center of the universe, with the Sun, the Moon, and the planets all orbiting around Earth. However, Ptolemy observed that the movement of the planets did not match his scheme, and so he added small orbits, called epicicles, to the model to try to make it work. Even though it was erroneous and complicated, the Ptolemaic system was functional enough to make predictions of planetary positions. The system took hold, influencing thinking for 1,400 years. The Roman Catholic Church adopted the system as part of its doctrine, which the church hierarchy held to even when Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473–1543, refuted it in 1543, arguing that the Sun, not Earth, is the center of the universe. In the 1570s, accurate measurements of planet positions that had been taken by Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, proved that the Ptolemaic system was inaccurate. But it was not until 1609, when German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, devised a better explanation of planetary orbits, that the Ptolemaic system was put to rest.
What areas of the United States did Hernando de Soto explore?
Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto, c. 1500–1542, ventured throughout the southeast before he caught fever and died along the banks of the Mississippi River, having been part of a brutal expedition that crushed the Inca Empire. In what is now Peru, in 1536 de Soto returned to Spain a hero. But he sought to go back to the New World and got his wish when King Charles I, 1500–1558, appointed him governor of Cuba and authorized him to conquer and colonize the region that is now the southeastern United States. Arriving in Florida in the winter of 1539, De Soto and an army of about 600 men headed north during the following spring and summer. In search of gold and silver, they traveled through present-day Georgia, through North and South Carolina, through the Great Smoky Mountains, and into Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. After defeating the Choctaw leader Tuscaloosa in October 1540 in south-central Alabama, the Spaniards headed north and west into Mississippi. They crossed the Mississippi River on May 21, 1540, and De Soto died later that same day. Since he had shown no mercy in his conquests of the native peoples, De Soto's troops sunk his body in the river so that it would not be discovered and desecrated by the Indians. Then his army continued on without him. Under the direction of Luis de Moscoso they reached Mexico in 1541.
What does 40 acres and a mule mean?
The term originated with Union General William T. Sherman, 1820 to 1891, toward the end of the Civil War. On January 16, 1865, in his march to the sea, the military advancement he led from Atlanta to Savannah, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside a tract of land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts for the exclusive settlement of 40,000 freed slaves. According to the order, each black family was to be given a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. All of the lands were former plantations that had been confiscated during the war. They became the jurisdiction of the Freedmen's Bureau. Though there was a provision for one or more of the captured steamers to ply between the settlements and one or more of the commercial points, to sell the products of their land and labor. There was no mention of providing a mule, or any other animal, to each freedman. The mules, tired army work animals, were distributed later to the landholders. News of 40 acres and a mule spread among the freed slaves. But soon after the war ended in April 1865, this promised to materially assist. The freedman was abandoned when President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, issued pardons for the ex-Confederates and ordered their lands returned to them. The somewhat obscure term 40 acres and a mule resurfaced in the 1990s and early 2000s as the issue of reparations came to the fore in the United States.
What was Camp David II?
In July 2000, President Bill Clinton, 1946, invited Israeli and Palestinian Authority leaders to the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, to hammer out a final peace agreement in the Middle East. In what could have been the major breakthrough in the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, 1942, agreed to a Palestinian state, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the administration of all Jerusalem holy sites by a third party, i.e. neither Israel nor Palestine. In exchange, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004, was asked to sign an end of conflict addendum to the final agreement, which would have required him to bring the militant Arab group Hamas under control and end all Palestinian attacks on Israelis. But Arafat refused the deal. The July 11 to 25 meeting ended without an agreement. Violence erupted again in Israel, beginning the Second Intifada.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884 to 1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a challenge match at London's Almack's Club. The match was highly publicized.
Who were Leopold and Loeb?
Nathan Babe Leopold, 1904 to 1971, and Richard Dickey Loeb, 1905 to 1936, were privileged, well-educated, even brilliant young men who committed what they believed to be the perfect murder. Both were from well-to-do Chicago families. In May 1924 Loeb, then 18 years old, became the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan. He was to go on to postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. 19-year-old Leopold was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and a law student there. The two became friends, and, as testimony would later reveal, in the fall of 1923 became convinced that they could literally get away with murder, that they could plan it, carry it out, and never get caught. On May 21, 1924, the pair carried out their dastardly plan. Their victim was 14-year-old Bobby Franks, son of a millionaire and cousin to Loeb. Franks's body was found, as were a pair of eyeglasses belonging to Leopold. The spectacles were traced to him, and he and Loeb, who was part of Leopold's alibi, were grilled by the police. They stuck to their story for exactly 1 day. Then Loeb, believing Leopold had betrayed him, confessed. They were charged with murder and kidnapping. Under the counsel of noted defense attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938, who had been hired by their families, the pair pled guilty, reducing what would have otherwise been death sentences to life in prison plus 99 years. In 1936 Loeb was killed by a fellow prison inmate. In 1958 Leopold was freed. His sentence had been reduced by Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson in exchange for the inmate's contribution to testing for malaria during World War II, 1939-45. He lived out his life in Puerto Rico, where he married, earned a master's degree, performed charitable works, and taught.
What was the nonviolence movement?
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. 1929 to 1968, was committed to bringing about change by staging peaceful protests. He led a campaign of nonviolence as part of the civil rights movement. King rose to prominence as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, when he delivered a speech that embodied his Christian beliefs and set the tone for the nonviolence movement, saying, "We are not here advocating violence. The only weapon we have is the weapon of protest." Throughout his life, King staunchly adhered to these beliefs even after terrorists bombed his family's home. King's arsenal of democratic protest included boycotts, marches. The words of his stirring speeches, comprising an impressive body of oratory, and sit-ins. With other African American ministers, King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 1957, which assumed a leadership role during the Civil Rights Movement. The nonviolent protest of Black Americans proved a powerful weapon against segregation and discrimination. A massive demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963 helped sway public opinion and motivate lawmakers in Washington to act when news coverage of the event showed peaceful protesters being subdued by policemen using dogs and heavy fire hoses. In response to the outcry over the event in Birmingham, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, proposed civil rights legislation to Congress. The bill was passed in 1964. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent activism. King's policy of peace was challenged 2 years later when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, tired of the violent response with which peaceful protesters were often met, urged activists to adopt a more decisive and aggressive stance and began promoting the slogan Black Power. The civil rights movement, having made critical strides, became fragmented, as leaders, including the highly influential Malcolm X, 1925 to 1965, differed over how to effect change. On April 4, 1968, King was in Memphis, Tennessee, to show his support for a strike of black sanitation workers when he was gunned down outside his hotel room shortly after 5:30 in the evening. As news of King's death swept over the nation, blacks in 168 American cities and towns responded with rioting, setting fire to buildings, and looting white businesses. Commenting on the terror, radical African American leader Stokely Carmichael said, "When white America killed Dr. King last night, she declared war on us." The chaos continued for a week. When the rioting ended on April 11, there were 46 dead, most of them black, 35,000 injured, and 20,000 jailed. Nevertheless, the violent crime that claimed the leader's life and the violence that erupted after news spread of his death have not, decades later, overshadowed King's legacy of peace and his message of the brotherhood of all people.
Who was the first person to reach the South Pole?
Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, 1872–1928, was first to reach the South Pole, in December 1911. Before earning this distinction, he had achieved another first sailing the Northwest Passage, from 1903 to 1906. Amundsen's desire to be an Arctic explorer had been with him almost his entire life. As a teen, he is said to have slept with his bedroom windows open year-round in order to become accustomed to the cold. When he was a young man of 21, he turned his attention away from the study of medicine to making an Arctic passage. He recognized that many of the previous, and failed, attempts to travel to the Arctic shared a common characteristic. The commanders of these expeditions had not always been ship's captains. He resolved to become an experienced navigator and soon took jobs as a deckhand on various ships. In 1897 Amundsen was chosen as the first mate on the Belgica, the ship that would carry the first Belgian Antarctic expedition under the command of Adrien Gerlache de Gomery. 1866–1934, also on board was the American Dr. Frederick Cook, 1865–1940, who had been on one of Robert E. Peary's, 1856–1920, earlier Arctic expeditions and who would, in 1909, dispute Peary's claim that he was the first to reach the North Pole. This was the same news that Amundsen would hear as he was preparing to make the North Pole. Upon learning of the success of Peary's 1909 expedition, Amundsen shifted his sights to reaching the South Pole instead, and quietly began to lay plans to do so. In fact, it was not until his expedition, which left Oslo in September 1910, was underway that he telegraphed his announcement back to Norway that he was in fact headed to the South, not the North Pole. As it turned out, a race was on between the Norwegians and the British. Shortly after Amundsen had set sail, naval officer Robert Falcon Scott, 1868–1912, had left England at the head of an expedition to reach the South Pole. The Norwegians landed at Ross Ice Shelf, Antarctica, on February 10, 1911. It was not until 10 months later, on December 14, 1911, on a sunny afternoon, that they raised their country's flag at the spot their calculations told them was the South Pole. Before heading north again, they celebrated their achievement with double rations. When British naval officer Robert Falcon Scott's expedition arrived at the South Pole on the morning of January 18, 1912, they found the Norwegian flag flying over it. On their way back the crew died due to bad weather and insufficient food supplies. Amundsen's Norwegian expedition arrived safely at their base camp on January 25, 1912.
Why is Mecca a holy city for Muslims?
Mecca, in western Saudi Arabia, is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570, and was his home until the year 622, when those who opposed him forced him to flee to Medina, a city about 200 miles north of Mecca. Muhammad later returned to Mecca and died there in 632. Mecca is also the site of the Great Mosque, which is situated in the heart of the city. The outside of the mosque is an arcade, made up of a series of arches enclosing a courtyard. In that courtyard is the most sacred shrine of Islam, the Kaaba, or Kaaba, a small stone building that contains the black stone, which Muslims believe was sent from heaven by Allah, God. When Muslims pray, 5 times a day, according to the 5 pillars of faith, they face the Kaaba. It is also the destination of the Hajj, or pilgrimage.
Who was Mary, Queen of Scots?
Mary Stuart was born in 1542 to James V of Scotland, who ruled from 1513 to 1542, and his wife, Mary of Guise. When Mary was just 6 days old, her father died, making the infant a queen. Her mother ruled the country as a regent until 1561, when Mary officially took on her duties. She was, by all reports, a beautiful and charming young woman whose courage and mettle would be tested by time. When she ascended the throne, she inherited her mother's struggle with the Protestants, who were led by John Knox, 1513 to 1572, a former Catholic priest who was involved in the Reformation. As a Roman Catholic, Mary was subject to harsh verbal attacks issued by Knox, who denounced the Pope's authority and the practices of the Church. But this was not the worst of her troubles. In 1565 Mary wed her English cousin, Lord Darnley, 1545 to 1567, in an attempt to secure her claim to the English throne as successor to Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, also her cousin. But Mary's ambitions would be her undoing. She quickly grew to dislike her husband, who became aligned with her Protestant opponents and successfully carried out a plot to murder in her presence Mary's advisor, David Rizzio, c. 1533 to 1566. Surprisingly, Mary and Darnley reconciled shortly thereafter, a politically savvy move on her part, and she conceived a child, James, who was born in 1566. Darnley had enemies of his own, and 1 year later he was murdered. Mary promptly married the Earl of Bothwell, 1536 to 1578, with whom she had fallen in love well before becoming a widow. Bothwell was accused of Darnley's murder, and though he was acquitted, his marriage to the Queen shocked Scotland. The people took up arms, forcing Mary to abdicate the throne in 1567. She was 25 years old. Fleeing to England, Mary, Queen of Scots, was given refuge by Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. Though she was technically a prisoner, Mary nevertheless was able to conspire with Elizabeth's enemies, including English Catholics and the Spanish, in attempts to kill her. When one such plot was discovered in 1586, Mary was charged for her involvement in it and was put on trial. Found guilty, she was put to death in 1587, though Elizabeth hesitated to take such action. Meantime, Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, 1566–1625, had taken on his responsibilities in 1583 after Scotland had been ruled on his behalf by regents since Mary's abdication some 16 years prior. He had promptly formed an alliance with Elizabeth I and, in 1587, accepted with resignation his mother's execution. In 1603 James succeeded Elizabeth, becoming James I, King of England, uniting Scotland and England under one throne. The union was made official about a century later, in 1707, when Parliament passed the Act of Union.
Who were the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge, or Red Khmer, were a group of Cambodian communists led by radical Marxist leader Pol Pot, 1925–1998. Between 1970 and 1975 the Khmer Rouge guerrilla force, supported by communists from neighboring Vietnam, waged a war to topple the U.S. supported government of Lon Nol, 1913–1985. On April 16, 1975, Lon Nol's regime fell. And the next day the Khmer Rouge seized the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. The ruthless revolutionary leader Pol Pot became prime minister of a communist Cambodia and instituted a reign of terror. In his attempt to turn Cambodia into an agriculture-based society, the Khmer Rouge systematically emptied the cities, forcibly moving the people onto collective farms where they performed hard labor. Anyone thought to be opposed to the Khmer Rouge was killed. An estimated 2 million people died by execution, overwork, and starvation. Pol Pot's experiment had failed, and his efforts to revolutionize Cambodia amounted to nothing short of genocide. A Vietnamese invasion ousted the Khmer Rouge in 1979 and installed a new leadership. But civil wars were fought throughout the 1980s. The warring factions, who had made various alliances among themselves, finally signed a peace treaty in 1991, under the watchful eye of the United Nations. Elections were held in 1993. The resulting constitution provided for a democratic government with a limited monarchy. At that point, the Cambodian leadership seemed to come full circle with Norodom Sihanouk. 1922, being crowned king in 1993, in 1970 Sihanouk had been deposed by Lon Nol, whose regime later became the target of the Khmer Rouge. During his lifetime Sihanouk made strides in establishing Cambodia's independence, and he enjoyed great public support. Due to failing health, he abdicated the throne in November 2004 and was succeeded by his son, Norodom Sihanouk, 1953. For decades after Pol Pot was deposed, he continued to lead a revolutionary force of the Khmer in Cambodia, though he remained out of public view. His own men turned against him in early 1998, and Pol Pot died in April of that year. In December, the last main fighting force of the Khmer Rouge surrendered to the Cambodian government. The event was broadcast on national television. Though some Khmer leaders remained in hiding and small bands of guerrilla fighters were thought to still exist, the radical Marxist group, which had terrorized Cambodia, no longer presented a threat to the government.
How did the Democratic Party begin?
The other and older principal party in the United States today, the Democratic Party, was founded around electing Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, to office in 1800, against Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. The party's platform favored personal liberty and the limitation of federal government. Installing Jefferson in office, the party then called the Democratic Republicans went on to get its candidates into the White House for the next 25 years. In 1828 they became known simply as Democrats, dropping the suffix. Depending on how one counts, there have been either 18 or 19 Democratic presidents. Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, is problematic since he was a Democrat before joining the National Union Party ticket as the vice presidential candidate in 1864. Some sources list both party affiliations, as in Democratic/National Union.
What is solidarity?
It was a worker-led movement for political reform in Poland during the 1980s, and it led to the downfall of communism. The movement was inspired by Pope John Paul II's June 1979 visit to his native Poland, where, in Warsaw, he delivered a speech to millions, calling for a free Poland and a new kind of solidarity. As scholar and author Timothy Garton Ash noted, without the Pope, no solidarity. Without solidarity, no Gorbachev. Without Gorbachev, no fall of communism. Shipyard electrician Lech Walesa, 1943, became the leader of Solidarity. Formed in 1980 when 50 labor unions banded together to protest Poland's communist government. The unions staged strikes and demonstrations. By 1981, Solidarity had gained so many followers that it threatened Poland's government, which responded, with the support of the Soviet Union, by instituting martial law in December of that year. The military cracked down on the activities of the unions, abolishing Solidarity in 1982 and arresting its leaders, including the charismatic Walesa. But the powerful People's Movement, which had also swept up farmers who formed the Rural Solidarity, could not be suppressed. Martial law was lifted in mid-1983, but the government continued to exert control over the people's freedom. That year Walesa received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to gain workers' rights and prevent violence. Solidarity continued its work for reform. In 1989, the collapse of communism on the horizon, people's movements in Eastern Europe had combined with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost to herald the system's demise. The Polish government reopened negotiations with Solidarity's leadership. Free elections were held that year, with the Labour Party candidates gaining numerous seats in parliament. In 1990 Walesa was elected president, at which time he resigned as chairman of Solidarity. Poland's Communist Party was dissolved that year.
Who were the Puritans?
The Puritans were members of a religious movement that began in England in the 1500s and lasted into the first half of the 1600s, when it spread to America as well. Influenced by the teachings of religious reformers John Wycliffe, c. 1330 to 1384, and John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, the Puritans were so named because they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. They believed too much power rested with the church hierarchy, its priests, bishops, and cardinals. That the people, called the laity or lay members, should have more involvement in church matters. And that the ceremonies ought to be simplified to stress Bible reading and individual prayer. Further, they defied the authority of the Pope, believing that each church congregation should have control of its own affairs, which should be guided by a church council, called a presbytery, made up of lay members. These ideas are familiar to Americans today since they provided the basis not only for many Protestant churches but also influenced the formulation of U.S. government. When the Puritans faced persecution at home, they became religious pilgrims, traveling to the New World, where they established both their religious and social belief system.
Who was the first woman in space?
The Soviets claim the distinction of putting the first woman into space. On June 16, 1963, cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova-Nikolova, 1937, was launched into space aboard the Vostok 6. She spent 3 days circling Earth. It was 20 years before the United States would match the accomplishment. On June 18, 1983, Sally K. Ride, 1951, and 4 other crew members were launched into space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Ride remained with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, for 4 years after completing the mission. She served on the Presidential Commission that investigated the 1986 Challenger disaster.
Did the Europeans introduce anything besides disease to the Americas?
Yes, in addition to certain diseases, which were accidentally imported into the New World by the early Europeans. The explorers brought with them many things that were previously unknown in the Americas. When Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, landed at Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, in 1492, he carried with him horses and cattle. These were the first seen in the Western Hemisphere. The American Indians had no beasts of burden prior to the arrival of the Europeans. In subsequent trips, Europeans introduced horses and livestock, including cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens, throughout South and North America. They later carried plants from Europe and the East back to the Americas, where they took hold. These included rice, sugar, indigo, wheat, and citrus fruits, all of which became established in the Western Hemisphere and became important crops during colonial times. With the exception of indigo, which was used as a fabric dye. These non-indigenous crops remain important to the countries of North and South America.